Welcome to Integrating and Decolonizing Indigenous Perspectives, Module 1, learning about Indigenous peoples and perspectives on Turtle Island. Brought to you by the Ontario Modern Languages Teachers Association, this module was created in collaboration with Sarah DeWard, Saray Jeppesen, Tiffany Alexandra Masiana Kelly, and Elder Eileen Beaver. Land Acknowledgement. As we begin, we honor the land itself and the Indigenous peoples who have stewarded it since time immemorial. Take time to learn and say the names of the nations who have cared for the land where you are located today. In much of Ontario, you'll find yourself on Anishinaabe land. In the east, it could be the Haudenosaunee land. While today's Western Ontario is Michif, along the northern shores you may sit on Cree land. These are each unique peoples and cultures who have had a relationship with the particular geography, plants, and animals of that area. The large place called Ontario is intimately known by several nations. Now imagine the incredible, seemingly microscopic depth of knowledge of the land that exists across the boundaries of Canada and then Turtle Island. We honor the intimate relationship with each hill and valley, the gentle, quiet relationship with the lakes and the life they provide. If you can, look outside right now. Notice that particular tree today, whether its leaves are hidden inside springtime buds or waiting patiently through the winter cold. I invite you to keep noticing that small piece of land. Is it the same tomorrow or the week and month after? This deep, steady rhythm of the land connects us to each other and to those who have inhabited and those who will inhabit this land. Disclaimer. Welcome to the Sensitivity module on Integrating and Decolonizing Indigenous Perspectives. Before we dive in, we want to take a moment to set the stage for what's ahead. This session will touch on important topics about the histories, cultures, and experiences of Indigenous peoples, and we recognize that some of these discussions may be challenging or emotional. Our goal is to create a space where everyone feels comfortable learning and growing together. We encourage you to approach the material with curiosity, openness, and respect, knowing that some of what we cover may invite you to think differently or reflect more deeply on your own views. Please remember that everyone's experience is unique, and Indigenous cultures and perspectives are diverse. We ask that you be mindful of language and respectful of the different views shared throughout this session. It's perfectly okay if you feel uncomfortable at times. That's part of the learning process. Support each other through this journey. This training is just the beginning, and we hope it sparks ongoing curiosity and respect for Indigenous peoples beyond today's session. Thanks so much for being here and for committing to this important learning experience. Let's get started with open hearts and minds. Some of this module's information will be familiar to you, some will be new. Some will resonate in different ways than it had before. Learning about Indigenous peoples and perspectives on Turtle Island, Module 1. In this module, you will review and learn foundational knowledge, Indigenous diversity, worldview, and shared principles, French language impact, and recommendations for further learning. Here is some information about our module contributors. Sarah DeWard is an entrepreneur, educator, author, and screenwriter of Métis descent. She is in the process of exploring her family's heritage and learning about how it has shaped her life. She's finding it a very enlightening process. Sarah's debut YA novel, White Lies, won the 2022 ETFO Writers Award for Women, and her second, Defy, was the CBC Books and Indigo Most Anticipated Read. DeWard was an educator for 20 years and has rediscovered her passion for marketing and communications, particularly in writing and content development. She is proud of the kind of mom she is, as well as her personal and professional accomplishments and drive. Saray Jeppesen is a Cree educator with a passion for community-driven response to local needs. She has worked with Indigenous groups to identify, plan, and respond to local issues for the last decade. Saray holds a Master of Education with a focus in Indigenous ways of knowing and how to better integrate Indigenous knowledge into existing systems of education and governance. Saray works to find whole systems perspectives and ensure that all voices are heard and respected. Tiffany Alexandra Masiana Kelly is an award-winning Inuk Dene writer, jeweler, and educator from both Kaluktuk Nunavut and Fort Simpson, Northwest Territories. She draws deep inspiration from her dual heritage, which is reflected in her culturally grounded children's books. Taught to bead by her grandmother, Kelly recalls learning the importance of precision, care, and tradition, values that continue to guide her art and teaching. Her work merges traditional and modern methods, such as using sublimation printing on hide to create one-of-a-kind earring designs inspired by nature. Alongside her art and writing, Kelly has worked as a teacher and administrator in both Nunavut and the NWT for over a decade. She currently lives in Fort Smith, NWT, with her husband, 2 sons, and their dog, continuing to be rooted in her northern upbringing and the cultural teachings of her grandparents. A word from our elder. Bonjour. Hi, my name is Eileen Beaver from Fort Smith, NWT, Treaty 8, Adhesion 4 Territory. I am honored to be included as your elder for your work in becoming an anti-racist educator. I ask that you keep an open mind and open heart, and I thank you for willing to find new collective opportunities to include Indigenous voice within your classroom. This work is a start to you venturing out of your comfort zone, and it may seem a bit like being a student all over again, but not to worry. This is information for you to learn and teach, space for the students to learn or contribute to. You know your French curriculum, and you also know what tools will best fit each unit, lesson, and daily plan. These modules have been collectively put together for you as an educator who is willing to learn in a holistic way. Look for the resources you have access to in the school. Who are the Indigenous consultants? Visit the community of your Indigenous students and introduce yourself and your intentions. Grasp the richness and diversity of Indigenous languages and cultures to support your goals and objectives of indigenizing your classroom. Your first venture is to get to know the Indigenous peoples you are connected to through your students by meeting leadership, role models, parents, and families you can rely upon as mentors. Remember, it is okay to think outside the box, and change is good. Elder Eileen Beaver. Before we begin, we encourage you to be intentional and reflective by celebrating the diversity, wisdom, and strength of Indigenous cultures, becoming more familiar with Indigenous concepts, perspectives, and practices, understanding the importance of relationship and reciprocity, exploring connections between French and Indigenous peoples, approaching learning with humility, teachability, and openness. Note, in crafting these modules, we have embraced a process that is as intentional as it is collaborative, matching content with thoughtful methodology by inviting diverse voices to contribute to every aspect of the writing. Guided by the wisdom of an elder, our 3 creators have woven together their unique experiences and perspectives, ensuring that each element of the module is grounded in both personal insight and collective responsibility. This approach not only enriches the content, but also models the kind of inclusive, reflective practice that we hope to inspire in educators. Together, we invite you to join us on a journey of learning, unlearning, and meaningful integration as we continue to build confidence, authenticity, and equity within the FSL classroom. Take a moment to pause and reflect on these personal questions. What assumptions do I have about Indigenous peoples? What do I have in common with Indigenous peoples? How am I different from Indigenous peoples? What am I most looking forward to in these modules? What am I most afraid of pertaining to these modules? You might find it worthwhile to note your responses down so you can come back to them. Let us begin with learning foundational knowledge. The history of Canada is deeply intertwined with the history, perspectives, and ongoing experiences of Indigenous peoples who have lived on these lands since time immemorial. It's crucial to understand their diverse cultures, histories, rights, and contributions to have a comprehensive understanding of Canada. Indigenous civilizations have always been here. Indigenous civilizations are sophisticated and complex societies. Everything is grounded in relationships and connection with the land. Indigenous civilizations are diverse throughout this land. The term Indian is considered inappropriate for describing Indigenous peoples in North, Central, and South America because it originated from a misnomer by Christopher Columbus, who mistakenly thought he had landed in India. This misnomer has a history of colonial use and carries negative connotations, leading to its widespread rejection by Indigenous communities. You may also hear some First Nations people refer to themselves as Indians. While there are many reasons for an individual to self-identify as such, this may be a deliberate act on their part to position and present themselves as someone who is defined by federal legislation. Indigenous is the preferred collective noun for original peoples of Canada and their descendants. Aboriginal is sometimes used and acceptable. Indian is highly offensive. Native is offensive. The Canadian Constitution recognizes three distinct groups of Indigenous or Aboriginal peoples. First Nations. There are over 630 First Nations communities in Canada, representing more than 50 nations and languages. Historically, they lived in diverse ways across the land, with many relying on agriculture, fishing, and hunting. Inuit, primarily inhabiting the Arctic regions of Canada, parts of Labrador, Quebec, Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and Yukon. The Inuit have a distinct language, Inuktitut, and a unique cultural heritage deeply connected to the northern environment. Their homeland is known as Inuit Niningait. Métis, descendants of historical unions between European settlers, mainly French or Scottish fur traders, and Indigenous peoples. The Métis are concentrated in the Prairie provinces and Ontario, but also live in other parts of the country. They have distinct cultural practice blending Indigenous and European traditions and are often recognized by the Métis sash and flag. Indigenous peoples is a term encompassing enormous diversity. Saying Indigenous is like saying Eurasian. It covers everything from France to Mongolia, Beijing to Tuscany. The Canadian Constitution recognizes three main groups: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. But within First Nations, there are hundreds of distinct nations, languages, and cultures, such as the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Cree, Dene, and Mi'kmaq. Inuit includes several distinct territories and language families across many unique Arctic geographies. For this reason, some argue against using Indigenous and call for using specific names of nations and peoples. Now would be a good opportunity to learn the specific names of the nations and peoples where you are and teach. Our use of the word Indigenous. We will use Indigenous and Indigenous peoples to include First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across Turtle Island. Given our Ontario focus, we will speak mostly about First Nations and Métis communities and perspectives. Indigenous also represents a spectrum of cultural connection, backgrounds, and attitudes toward cultural reclamation and Indigenous identity. Think back to the reflective questions at the start. How does the ask for specificity when using names and terms relate to your own identification by self and others? Word use en François. The only umbrella term we use is Autochtone, which includes Premier Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Premier Nations would be used when speaking about a specific nation, for example, Ojibwe, Cree. Please use the actual name of the nation where at all possible. Indigene is not a direct translation of Indigenous, and it has a negative connotation of lesser than. Do not use this term. Amerindian is an American term. We do not use this in Canada, as we don't use the term Indian unless we are speaking directly of historical documents like the Indian Act. As we continue, bring an open heart and remember that we are still learning about, from, and for each other. For the purpose of this presentation, we use the following terms: Indigenous peoples, the original inhabitants of this land and their descendants. Settler, people who came to Turtle Island as a result of immigration and colonization. Newcomers are also settlers. Canadian, everyone subject to the Canadian government. Many Indigenous people reject the label Canadian because it affirms colonial power. However, Canadian is not the opposite of Indigenous. This usage implies that Indigenous people aren't Canadian and can be used to stigmatize Indigenous people as outsiders. Treaty people. Treaties are agreements between Indigenous nations and the Crown, representing settlers, making us all treaty people. Treaties give rights to Indigenous people, but also carry responsibilities for settlers and all people under the Crown's jurisdiction today. If we are all treaty people, then we have both a shared history and ongoing obligations to one another. Indigenous rights are the inherent collective rights of Indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants of Canada. These rights are recognized and affirmed in Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982. However, the Constitution does not explicitly define these rights, leading to ongoing legal and political processes to clarify their scope and application. Key aspects of Indigenous rights include Aboriginal title, the inherent right to the land based on long-standing use and occupancy before European contact. Treaty rights, rights specifically outlined in treaties between Indigenous nations and the Crown. Self-determination and self-government, the right of Indigenous peoples to govern themselves and make decisions about their communities and lands. Cultural and social rights, the right to practice their own cultures, customs, languages, and spiritual beliefs. Rights to subsistence resources and activities, the right to hunt, fish, trap, and gather resources for sustenance and cultural purposes. The recognition and implementation of these rights vary between Indigenous groups and are continually being shaped through court decisions, negotiations, and government policies. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada has committed to implementing, also plays a significant role in shaping the understanding and application of Indigenous rights. In the Canadian context, treaties are legally binding agreements made between the Crown, representing the Government of Canada, and Indigenous peoples. These agreements typically involve the surrender of Indigenous title to land in exchange for certain promises and provisions. These promises can include the establishment of reserve lands, financial compensation, annuities, protection of hunting and fishing rights, provisions for education, and other benefits. Treaties are foundational documents that continue to shape the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state, and their interpretation and implementation remain critical issues. Now would be a good opportunity to learn more about the specific treaty or unceded land that shapes the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state on which you live and work. Throughout the 19th century, many pivotal events occurred that continue to impact Indigenous people today. The following are a few notes on the Indian Act. The Indian Act, originally enacted in 1876 and repeatedly amended, continues to govern First Nations. The Act exerts significant control over the lives of First Nations people, including governance, land management, and status. It is a tool of assimilation. The Indian Act in Education. While the Indian Act and residential school system primarily promoted assimilation into English-speaking Canadian society, in Quebec, some residential schools were run by French Catholic orders, leading to the suppression of Indigenous languages in favor of French. From the late 19th century to 1996, the residential school system operated where Indigenous children are forcibly removed from their families and communities to attend these schools, often run by churches and funded by the government. They face systemic abuse, cultural suppression, and language loss. This has had devastating and long-lasting impacts on individuals, families, and communities. Some schools in Quebec used French as the language of assimilation. The practice of renaming Indigenous people with European names, often French or English, occurs. We have many Indigenous families that continue to use these names, such as Antoine, Lafferty, Beaulieu, and Corneli, to name a few. In 1985, Bill C-31 was passed. This bill amended the Indian Act to address gender discrimination in Indian status rules, allowing women who had lost their status by marrying non-Indigenous men and their children to have their status reinstated. It also allowed First Nations to control their own membership. Indian women who married a non-Indian man no longer lost their Indian status. Indian women who had previously lost their status through marriage to a non-Indian man became eligible to apply for reinstatement, as did their children. Non-Indian women could no longer acquire status through marriage to an Indian man. Non-Indian women who had acquired status through marriage prior to 1985 did not lose their status. The process of enfranchisement was eliminated altogether, as was the authority to the Indian Registrar to remove individuals from the Indian Register who were entitled to registration. Individuals who had been previously voluntarily or involuntarily enfranchised under the Indian Act could apply for reinstatement. Bill C-31 was a significant step towards addressing historical injustices and restoring Indian status to many Indigenous individuals. Here are a few notes on numbers regarding Indigenous people in Canada. The total Indigenous population is close to 2 million people, which equates to approximately 5% of Canada's total population. Indigenous people are the fastest growing population in Canada. The Indigenous population grew by 42.5% between 2006 and 2016, and another 9.4% between 2016 and 2021. Our Indigenous people include the youngest population in Canada. 44% are under 35 years old. Of the three main Indigenous groups, there are approximately 1.05 million First Nations people. They comprise 58% of our Indigenous population. We have approximately 624,000 Métis, who represent approximately 34% of our Indigenous population. There are approximately 70,500 Inuit. They make up approximately 4% of our Indigenous population. Please note, these percentages are gathered from people self-identifying as part of one Indigenous group. There are many Indigenous families and people that have a Métis parent and a First Nations parent, or a First Nations parent and Inuk parent, and the children of these unions are often asked to choose which group they identify as. Important considerations. Legal status, treaty rights, and self-identification significantly influence how individuals and communities are counted and recognized. The Indian Act, treaty agreements, and varying definitions of Indigenous identity can complicate population statistics. Many individuals who self-identify as Indigenous may not be recognized under federal definitions or may be missed in the Canadian census, which can lead to undercounting and gaps in data. Understanding Indigenous demographics requires more than numbers. It involves recognizing historical context, lived realities, and the right of Indigenous peoples to define their own identities. Now that we have discussed foundational knowledge about Indigenous people and perspectives on Turtle Island, we can begin to learn about and discuss Indigenous diversity. It is important to understand that individual experiences are as diverse as the people and cultures here. Some individuals grew up immersed in traditional culture and language on their territories. Others grew up in urban settings with very limited connections to their specific nation or heritage due to the impacts of assimilation policies like residential schools and the 60s scoop. Some see their indigeneity as a very small component of their identity, and some are doing the work to reclaim cultural connections. A new urban indigenous culture is forming, which often blends tradition and modernity. For example, you might see artists like James Jones, Cree hoop dancer, also known as Notorious Cree, performing hoop dancing to hip-hop. You'll also see beaded medallions of NHL team logos and electric powwow music like A Tribe Called Red. At the same time, someone else from the same territory and nation may be focused on land-based practices like hunting and hide tanning. Ontario is home to numerous First Nations. Anishinaabe nations like Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Haudenosaunee nations like Mohawk, Oneida, and Cayuga, and Cree communities in the north. It also has a significant Métis population with distinct history and culture. In addition, there are growing Inuit populations moving to urban centers like Ottawa through their traditional homelands, known as Inuit Nunangat, are in the Arctic. Let's learn about Canada's First Nations. Our First Nations are the largest Indigenous group with over 630 communities across Canada. There are approximately 133 First Nations communities in Ontario alone. Numerous First Nations reside within Ontario's borders, each with their own distinct cultures, languages, and traditions. These nations belong to various linguistic and cultural groups, such as the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Cree, and Lenape. The languages and cultures of First Nation communities are both diverse and resilient. Now let's learn about Canada's Métis people. The term Métis refers to a collective of cultures and ethnic identities that resulted from unions between Aboriginal and European people in what is now Canada. Métis are recognized as one of the 3 Indigenous peoples in Canada's Constitution. The word initially referred to the children of these relationships, with many Métis communities flourishing along fur trade routes. However, over generations, it came to refer to the distinct cultural identities these communities developed. The Métis homeland, known as Métis Nation homeland, spans the prairies, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and parts of Ontario, British Columbia, the Northwest Territories, and into the northern United States. Ontario has a significant Métis population with a distinct history and culture arising from the fur trade and relationships between European settlers and First Nations people. The Métis Nation of Ontario is the recognized representative organization for Métis people in the province. Historic Métis communities in Ontario include those around Sault Ste. Marie, Rainy River or Lake of the Woods, Northern Lake Superior, Abitibi Inland, Mattawa Ottawa River, Killarney, and Georgian Bay. This recognition has also been problematic because people who do not meet the Crown's criteria for Indian status were and are often classified as Métis, even if they are culturally and geographically related to other First Nations. As a result, some people consider Métis people to be less Indigenous. As educators, it is helpful to be mindful of this fact and refer to Indigenous people by whatever nation or term they choose. Now let's learn about Canada's Inuit. Did you know that Inuit refers to a group, plural, whereas one person is an Inuk, singular? There are 4 regions that make up Inuit Nunangat. The Inuvialuit settlement region is located in the northern area of the Northwest Territories. Nunavut, Nunavik, which is northern Quebec, and Nunatsiavut, northern Labrador. Inuit Nunangat includes 53 communities and encompasses roughly 35% of Canada's landmass and 50% of its coastline. The majority of the 65,000 Inuit in Canada live in Inuit Nunangat, with 1/4 of our population living outside its borders. A growing number of Inuit reside in Ontario, particularly in urban centers like Ottawa. In 2017, it was estimated that around 3,800 Inuit lived in Ontario, with a majority in the National Capital Region. These individuals maintain connections to their culture and traditions while living in the South. Now that we have learned about our diverse Indigenous people, we will learn and discuss Indigenous worldviews and shared principles. A core principle woven through many Indigenous worldviews is interconnectedness, often expressed as all my relations. In Cree, this is called Wakatuan, sometimes translated as kin. Kin encompasses more than just humans. It includes people, animals, plants, land, water, and the spirit world. There are many layers of connections. On the individual level, mind, body, spirit, and emotions are intertwined and must be kept in balance. On the community level, individuals exist in relation to family, kin, and nation, with actions considered in light of their effects on these relationships. On the global level, relationships with the land lead to sustainability and balance, with the Haudenosaunee people considering how decisions will affect 7 generations. Indigenous identity and worldview are defined by these relationships. Well-being and wholeness. True well-being, wholeness, comes from maintaining balance and respectful, reciprocal relationships, generally known in English as having right relations. Reciprocity is a key teaching expressed in many aspects of Indigenous ways of being. We cannot address only one aspect in isolation. Key relationships include connection to spirituality, elders, ceremony, and our community. Within our communities, there are everyday acts as ceremony. Some elders have taught that simple actions done with intention and respect can be acts of ceremony. The focus is on mindfulness, respect, and acknowledging the interconnectedness in our daily life. The individual meaning varies. The same action might be ceremony for one person, but not another. Examples include smudging, sharing food or gifts, and learning a traditional skill like beading or fishing. The land is a source of sustenance, teachings, and belonging. Our Indigenous people have a deep, spiritual, and reciprocal relationship with the land. Land is kin, not property. We treat land as a living relative and source of identity, knowledge, and sustenance. This connection is central to cultural practices, governance systems, and worldviews. Colonialism disrupted this bond through forced displacement, environmental destruction, and loss of land and language. These disruptions undermine cultural continuity and community well-being. Despite these impacts, Indigenous communities are actively revitalizing their languages, traditions, and relationships to the land. Revitalization efforts include ceremony, land stewardship, education, and the assertion of Indigenous rights. As Indigenous people, we offer prayers or lay down tobacco to give thanks when harvesting plants or hunting, or feeding the fire when starting a ceremony. Turtle Island is the name many Indigenous peoples in North America use to refer to the continent now known as North America. The turtle represents life, endurance, protection, and the earth itself. The shell segments are often said to correspond to the 13 lunar cycles in the 28-day cycle of a woman, linking Turtle Island to timekeeping, nature, and balance. Turtle Island is deeply rooted in creation stories, spiritual teachings, and worldviews from various First Nations cultures, particularly among the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, and Anishinaabe people. There are many common elements in various stories about Turtle Island. A world covered in water. The stories often begin with a world entirely covered by water. The creator, or a supernatural being, a creator figure or a powerful being like Nanabush in some Anishinaabe traditions, or sky women in Haudenosaunee stories, play a key role. The dive for earth. In many versions, this being instructs animals to dive to the bottom of the water to bring back a piece of earth. Various animals try and fail. The muskrat sacrifice. Often, it is the muskrat who, through great effort and sometimes at the cost of its life, succeeds in bringing up a small amount of mud or earth. The turtle's role? The creator or the supernatural being then places this earth on the back of a turtle. The expanding land. The small piece of earth begins to grow and expand on the turtle's back, eventually forming the landmass we now know as North America. For some Indigenous people, the name Turtle Island also carries deep spiritual and cultural significance. It is a reminder of their creation stories and their connection to the land from time immemorial. The turtle, carrying the weight of the world, symbolizes the earth and the need to respect and care for it. The term is often used as a way to assert Indigenous identity and sovereignty, reclaiming a traditional name for the land in place of colonial terms like North America. Interconnectedness. The story emphasizes this of all living things and the importance of the contributions of even the smallest creatures. The term Turtle Island is used and referred to in many ways today. As a spiritual and cultural identity, Turtle Island is a sacred name and symbolizes a profound connection between people, land, and spirit. To represent decolonization, many Indigenous people use Turtle Island as a way to reclaim language and worldview, resisting colonial names like Canada or North America. With modern usage, the term is used in Indigenous activism, education, and environmental stewardship. You'll often hear land acknowledgements referencing Turtle Island as a way to honor traditional territories. No matter where we live in Canada, many Indigenous people have a shared set of principles. We have the 7 grandfather teachings, Anishinaabe, Dene laws, Inuit Kayumite and Teepee teachings. Each come from distinct Indigenous cultures across North America. Each tradition expresses its worldview through unique stories, symbols, and cultural practices. For example, the 7 grandfather teachings are often represented by animals, while teepee teachings use the teepee structure as a metaphor for community and values. Inuit Kayumite or IQ principles is a holistic knowledge system unique to Inuit, encompassing traditional knowledge, social values, and ways of living that have sustained Inuit for generations. Dene laws emphasize a deep relationship with the land and collective responsibility, reflecting the Dene understanding of interconnectedness and stewardship. Here is a visual that helps to explain the shared principles that many Indigenous people follow. Notice that although each principle group has its own unique name, they all include a respect for living things, hold collective responsibility, to live in harmony and balance, prepare for the future, and include personal and communal wellness. While Indigenous worldviews are incredibly diverse in their stories, symbols, and teachings, they share core principles: respect, balance, honesty, collective responsibility, and living in harmony with the land and each other. These teachings guide individuals and communities towards living a good life and sustaining future generations. Think back to the reflective questions at the start. What assumptions about Indigenous peoples have been challenged? Are there any threads of commonality to pull on? What is distinctly different or unique? Within Indigenous identity and culture, language carries culture, worldview, unique concepts, and connection to ancestors. Many Indigenous people will introduce themselves in their own language, whether or not those present can understand. In response, others offer their language as a sign of respect and connection. There are over 70 distinct First Nations languages, each tied to a unique culture and worldview. Michif, for example, is the traditional Métis language, a unique blend of French nouns and Cree Anishinaabe verbs and grammar. It reflects the cultural fusion at the heart of Métis identity. Michif is endangered, but being revitalized through community. The primary Inuit languages spoken across Inuit Niningait, the Inuit homeland in Canada, include Inuktitut, which is predominantly spoken in Nunavut and Nunavik, northern Quebec. It has various dialects. Inuinuktun is spoken in the western part of Nunavut, in the Kitikmeot region, and in the Northwest Territories around the community of Olahoktuk. Inuvialuktun is spoken in the Inuvialuit settlement region of the Northwest Territories. It includes dialects such as the Kangiriamiutun, Sax Harbor dialect, and Holman dialect. Labrador Inuktitut, also known as Inuktitut or Labrador-Miutut, spoken in Nunatsiavut, Labrador. Indigenous people in Ontario continue to reckon with the interruption and destruction of language, with many working intentionally to address and reverse these challenges. With language loss, while assimilation policies, especially residential schools, were primarily driven by the English, French colonial and missionary practices also contributed to the suppressing Indigenous languages and promoting French and Christianity in Indigenous communities. Revitalization efforts are used by many Indigenous communities to work to ensure their languages are taught to new generations, revitalizing Indigenous identity. Now that we have learned more about Indigenous worldview and shared principles, we will learn about the impact French language has had on our Indigenous people. French language includes contemporary issues and perspectives within Ontario. Indigenous people in Ontario continue to advocate for their rights and address ongoing challenges, including ensuring the spirit and intent of treaties are honored and fully implemented, resolving outstanding land claims and asserting Aboriginal title, engaging in meaningful consultation for resource development and ensuring their rights and interests are respected in resource development projects on their traditional territories, while also following up with the Indigenous groups, as applicable, throughout projects, with a meeting at end of project to summarize what went well, how it reflects the Indigenous people in the area, and what can be improved upon for future projects. Working towards meaningful reconciliation through truth-telling, education, and building respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Ontario. Indigenous people in Ontario continue to advocate for their rights and address ongoing challenges, including socioeconomic well-being, addressing disparities in areas such as education, healthcare, housing, and employment. While assisting with grants, scholarships, resource allocation, and more, many areas have become increasingly aware of verification of Indigenous identity and membership. Language revitalization efforts are underway in many Indigenous communities in Ontario to preserve and revitalize their languages. The Ontario Ministry of Education supports Native language programs in schools, offering instruction in languages such as Cayuga, Cree, Delaware, Mohawk, Ojibwe, Oji-Cree, and Oneida. Education. Increasing understanding of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit histories, culture, and perspectives is a growing focus in Ontario's education system. Curriculum revisions aim to make this learning mandatory for all students. Indigenous communities continue to advocate for self-determination, land rights, treaty implementation, and the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls for justice. Equally, other historical impacts are being raised and addressed, such as that of medical experimentation and sterilization of Indigenous people. Increasingly, there is awareness and action being taken relating to reconciliation across Canada, including in Canada's bilingual context. The French language remains a significant aspect of Canada's linguistic landscape, influencing interactions with Indigenous communities, particularly in Quebec, and is a key component of Métis languages like Michif. French language has had a significant and complex impact on Indigenous history in what is now Canada. It played a central role in early contact, trade, religion, colonization, and even resistance. The fur trade created extensive networks where French became a lingua franca, common language among Indigenous traders and European settlers. They translated religious texts and prayers into Indigenous languages and vice versa. But under French colonial rule, French became the language of education in many mission schools as a tool of colonization, which suppressed Indigenous languages and beliefs. French language schooling, especially later in residential and mission schools, was used to erase Indigenous languages and cultures. Many treaties and agreements with Indigenous people in Quebec and surrounding regions were written or negotiated in French. Overall, the presence of early French settlers in what is now Canada has been identified by complex relationships with various First Nations, alliances, conflict, and layers of trade partnerships. In addition, many Indigenous place names were inaccurately recorded or altered by French traders and missionaries, or given French translations of Indigenous names. Some First Nations have become known by the term the French called them, the Saulteaux, for example. Today, French remains a dominant language in many Indigenous communities in Quebec, and some Indigenous leaders work in both French and their traditional languages. At the same time, Indigenous people in French-speaking regions often face double linguistic marginalization between French colonial influence and broader English-Canadian systems. However, many Indigenous communities in Quebec, New Brunswick, and Manitoba maintain a strong French Indigenous cultural identity. Think back to the intentions at the start. What Indigenous concepts, perspectives, and practices are becoming clearer? How do you make sense of some of the connections between French and Indigenous people? Where does the importance of relationship and reciprocity fit in? The Métis language Michif blends French nouns and Cree Anishinaabe verbs and structure and is a living example of how Indigenous and French cultures and languages were intertwined. The French influences within Michif preserve vocabulary and language features from the specific dialects of Canadian French spoken by voyageurs and French settlers during the early contact period. Linguistically, Michif is unique for adapting almost its entire noun system from Canadian French dialects, but using the intricate grammar and verb system of Cree, including complex conjugations and grammatical structures that carry information not found in European languages. Cree verb conjugations indicate the speaker's beliefs about how possible or necessary an action is, and specify if the object or subject is animate or inanimate. Both Michif and French face pressure in Canada from English-speaking cultural and media dominance, as well as assimilation policies in the past and their effects today. We have learned much about our Indigenous people and perspectives on Turtle Island, which brings us to some recommendations for further learning. Please note, no one singular module or course could possibly stand on its own to introduce you to the Indigenous peoples and their perspectives on Turtle Island, so engagement with the following resources are encouraged. To learn more about our First Nations, you can read Indigenous Peoples Within Canada, A Concise History. This is a brief but comprehensive overview of the long and vibrant history of Indigenous people within what is now Canada. This engaging chronological text offers a multifaceted account from time immemorial and pre-contact to present-day movements towards self-determination. Ways of Being in the World, an Introduction to Indigenous Philosophies of Turtle Island, is an anthology of the Indigenous philosophical thought of communities across Turtle Island, offering readings on a variety of topics spanning many times and geographic locations. It was created especially to meet the needs of instructors who want to add Indigenous philosophy to their courses, but are unsure of where to begin, as well as for students, Indigenous or otherwise, who could benefit by learning to broaden their horizons with materials not found in the typical philosophy course. First Nations 101, Tons of Stuff You Need to Know, provides a broad overview of the day-to-day lives of Indigenous people, traditional Indigenous communities, colonial interventions used in an attempt to assimilate Indigenous people into mainstream society, the impacts these interventions had on Indigenous families and communities, and how Indigenous people are working towards holistic health and wellness today. To learn about our Métis people, you can read Métis Rising. This has a cross-section of perspectives to tell the histories and stories of people from richly varied backgrounds, demonstrating that there is no single Métis experience, only a common sense of belonging and a commitment to justice. The Northwest is our mother, the story of Louis Riel's people, the Métis Nation, helps readers learn about Métis and how their story began in the last decade of the 18th century in the Canadian Northwest. Within 20 years, the Métis proclaimed themselves a nation and won their first battle. Within 40 years, they were famous throughout North America for their military skills, their nomadic life, and their buffalo hunts. To learn more about our Inuit people, you can read Sakoyak, Stories from the Lives of 3 Inuit Women, a story sharing the contrasting experiences of 3 successive generations, a grandmother, daughter, and a granddaughter. Their memories and reflections give readers a poignant insight into the history of the people of the new territory of Nunavut. What I Remember, What I Know, The Life of a High Arctic Exile. Larry was almost 3 years old when his family was chosen by the government to be one of 7 Inuit families relocated from Nunavut to the high Arctic in the early 1950s. They were promised a land of plenty. They were given an inhospitable polar desert. Larry tells of loss, illness, and his family's struggle to survive, juxtaposed with excerpts from official reports that conveyed the relocatees' plight as a successful experiment. Whose Land is a web-based app that uses GIS technology to assist users in identifying Indigenous nations, territories, and Indigenous communities across Canada. The app can be used for learning about the territory your home or business is situated on, finding information for a land acknowledgement, and learning about the treaties and agreements signed across Canada. Educational videos are available to watch that will give you a better understanding of why land acknowledgements are important and the way Indigenous people view their relationship to land. The app consists of 6 different maps of Indigenous territories, treaties, and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. As we come to the end of the module, consider now the meaning of the phrase, "Every child matters." With a focus on the well-being and rights of all children, particularly Indigenous children in Canada, how will you use what you've learned to emphasize the importance of acknowledging the historical injustices faced by Indigenous children, specifically as a result of residential schools, and promote continued reconciliation and healing through truth-telling and advocacy? Listed are a variety of sources and appendices that have invaluable information and resources that you may also check out for further information. Your support and feedback support the development of future professional learning series. Please take a moment to complete the following survey by clicking on the link or scanning the QR code. Should you have any questions about this module, please send an email to omlta@omlta.org. These modules were created under the leadership of the Ontario Modern Languages Teachers Association. The OMLTA is a nonprofit professional association that has been supporting French as a second language and international language teachers of all programs and grade levels since 1886. These modules were designed to support FSL teachers to becoming anti-racist FSL educators through the development of the foundations presented in this series so they may feel more comfortable, confident, and equipped to be equitable and inclusive in their second language learning classrooms in a manner that is sincere and authentic. The Ontario Modern Languages Teachers Association would like to thank the Ministry of Education for its financial support in developing this module series. Special thanks to the educators who contributed their expertise and the experience to the development of these modules.